The world of sports is unbridled passion. We see that every Super Bowl when hundreds of millions gather to experience this grand event. In sports, so many regard the field, the track, the court, sacred territory. It's no place for protest. Or is it? Perspective is everything, and we call this episode Taking a Knee.
October 1968, two of the greatest athletes in the world are spotted on the tarmac at LAX, having just arrived from Mexico City, Tommy Smith and John Carlos. As soon as they enter the terminal, they are swarmed by the media, including our own cameras, capturing this forgotten moment. Just the day before, these two athletes were celebrated as victors on the world's biggest stage.
It's John Carlos right now. It's Carlos and Smith, and here comes Tommy Smith.
They came in first and third in the 200-meter dash, and then stood on the victory platform with bowed heads, wearing black socks and gloves in a racial protest.
Immediately, the giant stadium erupts with anger.
There were some boos in the stadium last night. ABC sports editor Howard Cosell spoke to Tommy Smith after he accepted his gold medal.
Do you think you represented all black athletes in doing this?
I can say I represented Black America.
The demonstration drew such vitriol, the U.S. Olympic Committee kicked them out. They arrived back home to a country that was bitterly divided over race. They were villains and heroes, receiving death threats and applause.
How you feel? Great. How you feel? Great. Yeah. Welcome home, man. Good to be home. Welcome home. You hear that? How you feel about the applause, right?
We didn't hear that in Mexico.
Yeah, well, you know, not everybody was in Mexico.
On ABC, the very network airing the Olympics, Cosell tries to provide clarity from the athlete's perspective.
The black athlete says he is part of a revolution in America, a revolution designed to produce dignity for the black man, and that he is a human being before he is an athlete. He's aware of backlash, but says he's had it for 400 years.
We really expect black athletes to not think and not to offer opinions because we just want them to entertain us, bring us joy for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, and then go away somewhere and be quiet.
UCLA's Tyrone Howard says we have changed very little since Smith and Carlos. The bitter fight on our streets for fairness continues, and so does the anger towards athletes who peacefully protest.
Colin Kaepernick was vilified when he took a knee, and there were lots of people who felt like there was no place in sports for a protest.
Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, get that son of a off the field right now, out, he's fired.
It was not at all about the desecration of our flag or our soldiers or anything like that. It was about the injustice that black people had endured. And that's what we did through the 60s.
Donjale Abernathy's father, Ralph Abernathy, was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s partner in the civil rights movement. When she saw Kaepernick take a knee, it stirred memories from her childhood when taking a knee was an important gesture of peaceful protest.
Photo after photo after photo after photo of black people on their knees during the civil rights movement, especially in the face of oppression.
A half a century later, our streets are still boiling over, and so is the rage directed at athletes who make a peaceful gesture for change.
So keep the political commentary to yourself, or as someone once said, shut up and dribble.
You need to essentially just shut up and dribble, as one commentator said about LeBron James. But it's this idea that somehow we want our athletes to not think. So I applaud many of these athletes today because they're taking stands, they're being vocal, they're putting their careers at risk.
Smith has done it with his hands in the air.
Smith and Carlos never ran another race. Colin Kaepernick never played another down.
And so the Olympic Games for the United States have become a kind of America in microcosm, a country torn apart. Where will it all end? Don't ask the U.S. Olympic Committee. They've been too busy preparing for a VIP cocktail party next Monday night in the lush new Camino Real. Howard Cosell reporting from Mexico City.
Where will it all end? 55 years later, we're no closer to an answer.
In the years following the '68 Olympics, Tommy Smith and John Carlos fell on hard times. They couldn't find jobs. At their lowest point, the stress from financial struggles and being vilified was so overwhelming, Carlos's wife committed suicide. Most have no idea the cost of peacefully asking for fairness. 6 million innocent Jews were systematically murdered during World War II. 1.5 million of them were children. That's the Holocaust. That's what Hitler, his Nazis, and their followers did. Holocaust Remembrance Day is important because we must acknowledge how evil and weak man can be and fight against it. It can happen again. We call this episode of Facism Wildflowers.
Wildflowers, reaching for the sun. Spring in the German countryside of Bavaria is beautiful. But in these fields, if you wander deep enough, you'll find something that's hiding behind the bloom. Truth. These German historians, husband and wife Helga and Manfred Dieler, have been fighting the flowers, the trees, and the fog of distant memory for decades, trying to keep that truth in plain sight. And it is a fight where the opposition is growing stronger.
This is Kaufring Camp number 7, and it's a subcamp of the Dachau concentration camp.
During World War II, Kaufring Camp in Landsberg was one of the most horrible places on earth. Jewish prisoners were forced into slave labor, starving, freezing, then crammed into these earthen huts without an inch to spare.
And of course you have in the morning maybe a dead person beside of you. Must have been terrible.
You've seen the shocking images and heard the incredible stories from the brave survivors and liberators. Yet, there's a growing number of hateful people choosing to deny it ever happened. Even here in Germany, where it actually took place, there are disturbing efforts to erase the past.
I'm born here in Landsberg, 58, and we haven't heard about the history of the camps here in the area.
Helga has lived just blocks from this camp, yet never was taught what it was. She tells me they did learn about Dachau and Auschwitz in school, but only in terms of pre-World War II.
We wanted to know the truth. We wanted to know what all happened in the time of in the Nazi time within our city, and then we realized it's so hard to get answers. And I said, why is it?
The only way Helga and Manfred learned of this camp was from reading the English transcripts from the Dachau trials, where Nazis and their shocking atrocities were exposed.
This can't be true. This can't be in our neighborhood, and you'd never hear anything about it.
It was then she and her husband made a remarkable commitment. They bought this land to preserve the Kaufring camp so they can tell the story.
I think it's so important that something is left of this time, and I think also these monuments, they have their own, how to say, I think they talk to us.
Here, there are so many lessons, not just about Nazis, Hitler, and hate, but about how everyone looked the other way, enabling mass murder against fellow humans.
So you can see a part of the Death March in Landsberg.
They show me photos of the infamous Death March when Hitler ordered the Jews to be marched away from the front lines so he could continue to use their slave labor. The photos prove atrocities were not hidden in the camps. They were out in the open. We are standing at the very spot where these were taken, transported back to that moment.
You see here normal people sitting and looking at the Death March.
Nearby, you'll find a monument to the march. 22 of them went up along the route in 1989. But Helga tells me their attitudes have changed since then. There's a growing number of Germans who no longer want to talk about the Holocaust, even the government. Helga and Manfred applied for a permit to build a simple restroom on their property for visitors. That was 10 years ago. They're still waiting. To further the point, Helga brings me here, a cemetery in town. This is the site of a mass grave where thousands of murdered Jews from the camps are buried. Yet, never, in the many times she's come here, has she ever seen another person visit. Not one.
So it's necessary that if people come here, they have to know what place this is.
Yeah.
As we leave the cemetery, Helga tears up, frustrated. They have given everything to this cause, yet feel they have fallen short.
I feel there is not done enough, and I can do more.
We often say, time heals all. But does it? 80 years later, truth and the horrible lessons about hate are still here, but they're much harder to see. These beautiful wildflowers are simply camouflage.
You may be wondering, Helga and Manfred are not Jewish. They're simply historians with kind hearts who believe in the truth and doing what is right. They have a tough fight ahead of them, but they will not back down. They are setting the example for the rest of us. Back to you. Read Across America Day used to be called Dr. Seuss Day. It was chosen on March 2nd because it was his birthday. He was a beloved author of children's books who helped generations learn to read. And then his darker, racist past was exposed. But before you ban his books, learn his story. Perhaps it's his greatest lesson. We call this episode The Grinch.
You're a mean one, Mr. Grinch.
For so many, the Grinch is lovingly ingrained in our holiday memories. But is it time to lock him out? Because the more we learn about Dr. Seuss, whose real name is Theodore Geisel, the more we discover how flawed he was. It's complicated.
When he was starting out in the 20s and 30s, he did a great deal of cartooning that was undeniably racist.
Dr. Seth Lehr is an expert in the history of children's literature. He's a professor at UC San Diego, which happens to be the home of the Geisel Library and the Dr. Seuss collection. Lehr describes him as a young man who had a lot to learn.
Ted Geisel is not alone in having done things when he was young that we would want to remove from public libraries or that we don't want to talk about.
Like this shocking cartoon from 1929 he created for Judge magazine. Geisel was 25. Your attention is drawn to one thing, the N-word. Then you notice the African Americans in the picture having a ghastly appearance, modeled from blatant stereotypes.
It's very difficult to look at this stuff now. It's extreme.
In fact, many of his comics perpetuated insulting stereotypes. Black people are often portrayed as African natives. Asians had severely slanted eyes, glasses, buck teeth.
I'm certainly not happy with the anti-Asian and anti-Japanese political cartooning of the Second World War.
That's when he unfairly portrayed Japanese Americans as the enemy, showing them deceitfully waiting for the signal from home. 6 days later, President Roosevelt ordered 120,000 innocent people of Japanese descent locked up. Perhaps Geisel's heart was too small.
His heart was 2 sizes too small.
But there's another side to the story.
And a lot of the challenge is, how do you read the new stuff through the old stuff?
Even though he never officially talked about it, Geisel's later work clearly is written with a kinder, more embracing tone.
Running from the star-bellied Sneetches, through the Lorax, through all the places you'll go. And all of these are books that are clearly designed to have a tolerance-giving sensibility.
Yes, Dr. Seuss evolved from respecting your fellow man and the earth to exploring the world. Some even suspect Horton Hears a Who is an apology to Japanese Americans.
I don't know if it's a direct apology, but I think it's very clear that through the persona of Dr. Seuss, Geisel had to confront that earlier legacy. I think Horton Hears a Who is a great example of it.
A person's a person, no matter how small.
As we grow older, we often recognize our ignorance. Is that what happened to Dr. Seuss? One mind-blowing theory, The Grinch is actually autobiographical. Could Geisel be writing about himself? Was it his heart that grew 3 sizes?
That the Grinch's small heart grew 3 sizes that day.
So what do we do now?
Maybe, The Grinch is a story about saying, my heart has grown, but it's up to the people of Whoville to welcome him back.
That's quite the twist, a plot that puts you on the spot. Yes, Theodore Geisel made mistakes, but he also tried to atone for them, teaching us a great lesson. People can learn and change. Is that enough?
What is the half-life of stupidity? What is the point at which we say, all right, this is something we can excuse?
Just like The Grinch, Geisel is only part of the story. The rest is up to you. Will you or won't you welcome him back to Whoville?
So Dr. Lair sees today as an opportunity to teach about these more complicated issues in life. Racism, yes, but also how people can change and become wiser. As for Dr. Seuss's kinder books, Lair says childhood is a place of humor. It's a place of unbridled exploration. And that's where Dr. Seuss is at his best. What's interesting is everything is in theory, because Dr. Seuss never actually talked about it and ever said that the Grinch was autobiographical. But there are a lot of people who have studied his life and said they think it is. During World War II, a segregated unit of Japanese Americans in the U.S. Army became known as some of the greatest fighters in U.S. history. This story focuses on one soldier in particular who teaches us about an entire generation of remarkable Americans. To understand how important he is, we take you to Italy. We call this episode of Facism, Love Stanley.
Deep in the mountains of Tuscany, there is a picturesque hamlet that has been here since the Middle Ages called San Lorenzo Monte. And right in the center of town at what used to be an old church is a museum that unexpectedly pours gratitude unto the Japanese-American soldier. But why? The answer lies 6,000 miles away in downtown LA. It's a diary and one of the most valued possessions at the Japanese-American National Museum.
January 1st, 1943. Well, today is the first day of the year, 1943. I wonder what it has in store for me. Wonder what it has in store for everybody. Wonder when the war will end.
That's how it all began. The first entry by 16-year-old Stanley Hayami from San Gabriel, Judy and Daniel's uncle. Stanley and his family had been forced out of their home and incarcerated at Heart Mountain internment camp. His young but deep thoughts and beautiful sketches are still alive on these yellowed pages.
I resolved to be more understanding of others and more appreciative. And his resolution number 1 was, I resolved to be more tolerant.
After graduating from Heart Mountain High School, Stanley enlisted in the Army and became part of the 442nd, a segregated unit of Japanese-American soldiers, many, like Stanley, fighting for the very country that unjustly locked them up. Stanley's letters home were funny, filled with sketches and optimism, and always signed, Love, Stanley. He was one of those Japanese-American soldiers that liberated San Lorenzo. Just outside the museum, I meet 88-year-old Luisa Chinka. She remembers when the Nisei soldiers came through here, and with great joy says the first one she met could have been my twin. But inside the museum, she's a different person. You don't have to speak Italian to feel the depths of her pain. She points to the photos on the wall. These are villagers that she knew as a child. On a late summer afternoon in 1944, the Germans, occupying the town, rounded them up and executed them. 184 people, mainly women and children, and 6 of them are Luisa's family members, including her mother.
It's very difficult. Also, after a lot of years, it's very difficult to accept this.
It was soon after this massacre the Nisei fought their way into town and crushed the Germans. Now, we understand their gratitude. But liberation comes with a price, and it's here that this talented, funny, sensitive teenager crawled out into the open to help two wounded comrades and was cut down by a sniper's bullet. At Heart Mountain, the news of the end of the war in Europe came before word of Stanley's death. Stanley's parents were at a party, celebrating the belief that their son made it through, when the telegram arrived. It was just 3 lines. Your son, Private Hayami Stanley K., was killed in action in Italy, 23 April, 45. Stanley was forced to leave L.A. and never returned until his funeral. The procession traveled down First Street in Little Tokyo, right by where his diary sits today, laid to rest at Evergreen Cemetery next to many other Nisei heroes. Through the years, Stanley has become such an important figure, I wanted to learn more about his final moments. So I enlisted the help of Italian historians who live in the area. They studied the records, read eyewitness accounts, even found that list of Nisei that died in the fighting, handwritten from the battlefield. And at number 92, Stanley Hayami. They discovered that Stanley died right in front of the old church where we're standing. The deadly shot coming from that white building. But there's more. They lead me to, believe it or not, a small castle built in the 1300s, just 200 feet from where Stanley died. And as we go through a beautiful courtyard and green door, we enter a dark cellar. Among centuries-old wine barrels, he pulls something out.
Questa è la cantina dove è stato soccorso.
When we get back into the light, he hands me this. They believe this is Stanley's helmet. It's been sitting in this cellar for 77 years.
And this helmet was put there in this super heavy fighting that no one really paid attention to this helmet.
It was taken off of him as medics tried to save his life. The owner of the castle watched the scene play out. The helmet was left behind, so he picked it up and he stored it, never realizing who that brave soldier was. And only now, after we came calling, did the clues finally link together. 8 decades later, Stanley's tragic, poetic, incredible story lives on. Whether it's the helmet from a frightening moment or the pages of this diary, Stanley Hayami teaches us about what we lost in that war. These aren't the writings of a teenager. They're the writings of a generation. And that's why this one man means so much to so many.
Stanley was only 19 years old when he died. He was a straight-A student, a talented writer and artist, as you saw, but he gave everything up for this country. So on this Memorial Day, we take a moment to remember the brave like Stanley who sacrificed their young lives defending our freedoms. And we had no idea we were going to stumble upon his helmet 80 years later. And those Italians someday would love to bring that here to America to help teach Stanley's story. In the meantime, it stays over there in San Lorenzo.
Yeah.